Well, there are two major features here. One is NATO's expansion eastward toward the literal Russian borders, and two is the persecution of the culturally Russian or Russophone population in south and eastern Ukraine, which actually are historical Russian lands. So those two pieces of the puzzle came together, and they're both very, very complex. I mean, you're welcome to have this discussion now if you would like, but that's how I would summarize them. Those are the two pieces that are probably the most relevant to the war in Ukraine, which, for those who don't know, this has been discussed to death, I feel like. It started in 2014, it escalated in 2022, and it's a conflict that's now been going on for 11 years, right? It's not something that began in 2022.
If you can just walk us through what happened from 2014 till now.
Well, I want to go back very briefly to 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Most of the Soviet republics, excluding the Baltics and parts of the Caucasus, voted to stay within the Soviet Union. So this is one of those things that's very easily locatable in, like basic history of that period. But people seem to forget that that dissolution was against most people's wishes. But be that as it may, in the 1990s, the former Soviet republics, Russia and Ukraine especially, were in a state of collapse. It was a time when there were attempts to implement very dramatic and very rapid neoliberal reforms that created financial crises, hyperinflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So every negative consequence that you can imagine, from starvation to the rise of terrorism to the decline of birth rates, et cetera, it was present in both of these places. But at that time, a lot of NGOs moved in coming from the West, big NGOs that you can think of like USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, also ones coming from Europe as well, backed by, I mean, nominally they're independent, but of course they're getting funding from various government organizations. So it's kind of funny to call them independent. But nonetheless, they moved in and they started funding the so-called civil society. Now, when you're funding civil society, it sounds really nice on paper. It sounds like you're trying to create maybe pluralism, diverse points of view, but in reality, a lot of these organizations were trying to create in Ukraine. I would call it Project Anti-Russia, trying to use certain historical issues that were relevant to only one part of Ukraine, let's say in the West, where anti-Russian sentiment way in the West was present. Those are parts of Ukraine that were under Austria-Hungary and parts of Poland, many centuries ago. And so basically kind of trying to amplify a very small regional nationalism and apply it to the whole country. And so in 2004, there was an Orange Revolution. This was sort of the first attempt to bring to power a leader that was more West focused, which, his name was Yushchenko. He's married to an Ukrainian American, so there was that connection as well. But the changes in terms of society were not as dramatic. Now, in 2014 and 2013, 2014, in my opinion, this was the second attempt that was successful. It turned into a violent regime change. Officially, Ukraine calls it a revolution of dignity, which is kind of a unusual name to use for something that was so violent and in fact led to a civil war that then escalated into the current conflict between NATO and Russia, with Ukraine being basically used as the area where the conflict is taking place, and Ukrainians are being used as cannon fodder. But basically in 2014, there was what a lot of people would concluded was not a revolution. Now, of course, there were grievances against every government. If you go back and look, every I think there was maybe 5 or so presidents starting from the 90s, and they were all accused of corruption. There were protests against every single president, so this was nothing new. And of course, every country you can find some kind of grievances against the government. But usually these so-called color revolutions, they need some kind of fertile soil, right, to have unrest grow out of it, right? And that unrest may or may not be engineered, right? In the Ukrainian case, it was both. And so, without going into too much detail, the legitimate president was overthrown in winter 2014. This is when Russia basically used its naval base in Crimea, used that opportunity because it was being rented, and took over Crimea. The Western media calls it an annexation, which I guess technically it is, but Crimea had been Russian since the late 1700s. The majority of the population there is Russian. There has been multiple referenda since the 1990s, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in terms of either being autonomous or joining Russia. They're easily accessible online, so this was not anything that was just surprising and new. But then Ukraine launched the so-called anti-terrorist operation in the east and the south, basically calling the protesters against this new regime. These protesters did not acknowledge this regime. They did not perceive it as a legitimate government. This is when the war really began. And so it was pretty bloody. Western media, CNN, BBC initially covered it actually surprisingly fair. I mean, it wasn't really ideal, but a lot of those clips are still floating online. It's nothing like the way the current iteration of the war in Ukraine is being covered. So it's almost amusing that you can go back 10 years and see the coverage and how different it is versus what's being said now. I guess the expectation is that the average news consumer has the attention span of maybe a couple of weeks, which I don't necessarily think it's true, but I think some people just are more focused on, their daily grind as opposed to, thinking about foreign policy. But be that as it may. And so that conflict was very bloody. The initial numbers, I think I don't remember the exact date, but for maybe the first 6, 7, or even 8 years of the conflict, if you look at the UN numbers, the total casualties were in the 50,000. Now it included both sides, and the civilian deaths were in a few thousands. And then, of course, the question of civilian versus military is tricky because a lot of people who were civilian went to volunteer in the army. So they were sort of no longer civilian, but they were not professional military either. But be that as it may, all of these human rights organizations in the UN documented the extent of the carnage, which is why early on in 2014 and 2015, Russia under Putin, as well as Germany under Angela Merkel, and France, back then it was under Hollande, and Belarus was involved as well. These negotiations took place in Minsk, and of course Ukraine. They came up with Minsk agreements. So there were sort of two versions of these agreements. All kinds of things needed to be fulfilled on both sides. OSCE was supposedly watching the fulfillment of the whole list of issues that came up. But then, much more recently, we've learned that both from the former President Poroshenko in Ukraine, from Angela Merkel when she was no longer in power, and as well as Hollande, he was no longer in power either, that these agreements were basically used to arm Ukraine and to train them to NATO standards instead of actually create a long-lasting peace that's respectful of the different ethnicities, different languages, and religions that exist in Ukraine. And this led to the launch of the special military operation. There was this huge escalation. If you actually look at the shooting that was taking place in December, January, there's just this massive rise.
Yeah,